Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome at IAI, Istituto Affari Internazionali. My name is Alessandro Marrone. I'm the head of the defense program, and I'm going to be the moderator of the panel today, this conversation organized by my institute in partnership with the Finnish Embassy in Rome, which I do thank for the support. You are all very punctual, so actually we are starting at 4 p.m. sharp, which is just to dispel stereotypes about Italians and Rome. The title is NATO and Europe's 360-degree security, new perspectives, question mark. I think there's going to be a number of question marks this afternoon and hopefully some answers. But without further ado, I'm really glad to give the floor to Natalie Tocci, Director of IAI, for her keynote speech to kick off the conversation of today. Natalie, please.
Well, thank you very much, Alessandro, and let me just start off by saying just how delighted I am to be hosting this conference, both because of who we're organizing it with and also on what we're organizing it with. So let me say that this is actually not the first and hopefully not the last instance of cooperation that we have with the Embassy of Finland here, and more broadly, I would say that, you know, most recently we had actually hosted your president here in IAI, who's actually an old friend and a PhD colleague. Yeah? We had the same supervisor back in the days at the London School of Economics, so we go back together a long way. And it's also not the first time, and hopefully it won't be the last time, that we engage in cooperation between think tanks like ourselves and embassies such as yours. I was recently having an exchange on something completely different with our defense minister a few months ago, and we were having this, at times, you know, on some occasions almost surreal discussion about truth and where truth comes from. And the point that I was making to him is that indeed, you know, truth is very much the product also of an exchange that comes from perspectives, both obviously within institutions, but also in places like ours. And it's actually the coming together of the more in the box and the more out of the box thinking, where truth or something that gets as close to it as possible can actually be forged. So, first point that I wanted to make is really, yeah, I mean, as I said, absolutely delighted to be doing this and to be doing this in this particular way. But coming more to the substance of our discussion today, what I think is most important is to have this ongoing dialogue which really looks at security and looking at security in a 360 degrees way by bringing together the perspectives that can come from the north and from the south. And again, in a similar way, in the same way as truth can only be found by the coming together of minds that are in, you know, different professional quarters, I think it's equally true to say that truth or anything coming close to it when it comes to security is very much the product of the coming together of minds that come from different perspectives, including different geographical perspectives. And so particularly if you think about security and how it has changed over the last years, it becomes increasingly obvious how this is becoming increasingly the case. Our cooperation, particularly with partners in Northern Europe, including Finland, as I said, dates back a while ago, but it also was very much the product recently of the security threats that we came under. I think, for instance, about the security of critical infrastructure and the lessons that can be drawn and exchanged between different perspectives in the North and the South. That is actually something and a work strand which we began several years ago. Even dating back before that, if we think about regions like the Arctic And again, the value added and the perspectives that a country like Italy can actually bring to bear on reflections about Arctic security. But then perhaps most importantly, and this is really what I wanted to focus on in the next couple of minutes, and then I promise I'll give the floor to those that actually know far more than me about the subject, is really the way in which it's becoming increasingly obvious that security in the north, the east, and the south really cannot be disentangled from one another. It's interesting that we're having this conversation today, the day after the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. And of course, we have known for a long while that other players, beginning with Russia obviously, do not make that distinction between the East and the South. Now, that distinction may be there in a way, and it's an important way, which I think we need to bear in mind, which has to do with the intention. I think that whereas when we come to the South, the way in which Russia looks at the South is in perhaps more, let me say, traditional realist terms, right? I mean, it's more a game of geopolitics. It's more a game of gaining some chips that you can perhaps use in other theaters. And when it comes to the East, particularly Ukraine, but as we know, not only Ukraine, it is far more of an ideological project which is driving this mission. So I think there are differences there that particularly when it comes to Russia we need to bear in mind, but it is fairly clear that the chips that Russia has been trying to accumulate, right, in regions like the Middle East have been there and have served the purpose to expend, in a sense, also in Eastern Europe. I think this is something that intellectually we've understood for a while, but practically we have very much resisted acting upon that acknowledgement. And I think we've resisted acting it in ways which at times have reinforced many of the prejudices that we have vis-à-vis one another. And so it's very typical that, you know, countries in Southern Europe, for example, would look at countries in the North and the East, essentially saying, you know, you don't really understand the South, you don't really understand its importance, and vice versa. And, you know, whereas I think, as I said, that our adversaries look at these interconnections far more than we do, the value that we have is actually in learning from one another a lot more, which I really think is the purpose of a meeting today. And I think very last thing that I wanted to say is that this becomes all the more important in a broader context in which we may be increasingly asked to do all this alone. I know that this is a very sort of uncomfortable conversation to have, and obviously it relates to the US's disengagement from European security. I personally am of the view that we will be able to we will probably bend over backwards, but we will not be able to actually reverse a trend which, Trump or no Trump, is probably structural in nature. But even if you don't agree with me, and even if you actually do think that there is a way to retain the US hook to European security, if there is one thing that will guarantee that the US will disengage, is for us to continue assuming that it will remain engaged. And so whether we agree or disagree on what the end point is, I think the course of action has to be exactly the same. And that course of action has to be of a greater European responsibility for our own security, whether we're looking at it from the north, from the east, or from the south, and perhaps one day even from the west, but so far, thankfully not. And the only way for that greater responsibilization for our security has to do if the lessons drawn, the experiences lived, and the knowledge accumulated is actually shared between our different countries. Anyway, I've said far too much, and now I thank you again all for being here, and now on to those who know far more than me about all this. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you very much for your keen speech, very thought-provoking and very good scene setting. Without further ado, let's move to the panel conversation. The rules of engagement are pretty simple. In the first round, each panelist will have 5 minutes to do his, her, or his own remarks. Then I will make a follow-up question with a 2 minutes reply. And finally, I will open to the floor, since we have a very high-level and distinguished or qualified audience of policymakers, practitioners, and experts. So let's start to my right with Alessandro Azzoni, Deputy Director General for Political and Security Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, so MAECI, our Farnesina. And Alessandro, could you please outline Italy's view on the NATO role in Europe with respect to both eastern and southern flank? And I think it's enough before we add even western flank.
Definitely, I hope so. Thank you very much. Thanks to my friends in Istituto Affari Internazionali for inviting me. And okay, let's start with a quote which did not age very well when somebody described NATO as brain dead, and then Putin invaded Ukraine, and it was not brain dead at all. But on the contrary, over the last 2 years and a half, the alliance has undergone tremendous change, mostly driven by the reality imposed to all of us by the Russian aggression, but also by a more thorough adoption of the 360 degrees approach into NATO's analysis of the security environment. As far as Italy is concerned, we view the strategic concept adopted in Madrid in 2022 as the guiding light for NATO's role in ensuring collective defense in the Euro-Atlantic area. As such, Russia is, I quote, the most significant and direct threat to Allied security and to peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area, end quote. In this regard, NATO could be seen as going back to its core business. Some describe this as kind of a back to the future, but apart from leaving aside the catchphrases or Hollywood ideas, I think that saying that we're back to the future does not capture the differences that exist between NATO's task at the time of the Cold War and what we're facing today. In particular, Finland's and Sweden's accession have radically altered NATO's reach in the Baltic Sea, kind of a NATO lake, some described it, and in the High North, making our lives easier from a certain point of view, but creating also new vulnerabilities. Unlike the other allies that neighbor Russia, for example, Finland does not host multinational battalions. This is not for any kind of lack of solidarity, but on the contrary, a tangible demonstration of the considerable amount of work that needs to be done in order to transition from a relationship based on a partnership to the status of full-fledged ally. All the more so while avoiding sending escalatory messages to our trigger-happy eastern neighbor. However, the set of challenges we must tackle is broader than in the past now. We must protect critical undersea infrastructure. We saw what happened in the Baltic Sea during the last weeks. And I think personally that a mission in the Baltic Sea could be worth exploring. Russia has also shown its willingness to carry out a campaign of hybrid activities against NATO, including through the instrumentalization of migrations, and I am very worried about what can happen in Syria in the coming weeks. Italy and Finland in particular, we worked together on this issue over the past months and will continue to do so, proving how northern and southern allies, as Natalie said before, can cooperate on shared security concerns. Overall, you can see there are many more challenges that NATO must take into account to succeed in its mission, and without intruding into the prerogative of member states. In fact, in addition to its traditional role in defense planning and standard setting, the alliance is now a platform to share best practices among allies and coordinate national responses in sectors within the domestic jurisdiction that still are relevant for our collective defense. Things about supply chain, the resilience of supply chains. And here a lot can be done within the EU, because we shouldn't forget that since the accession of Sweden, Finland, 97 EU citizens out of 100 are also citizens of a NATO member country. 97 out of 100. So any kind of dialectics between EU and NATO risks to be a dialectic between staffs more than between countries and peoples. So going back to the initial question is that we see a huge role for NATO in the south too. There's a deterrence and defense activities to perform vis-à-vis Russian activities in the Mediterranean. Most of all, NATO can provide a real added value in crisis prevention and management, and through cooperative security in the southern neighborhood. We just delivered the so-called SNAP, Southern Neighborhood Action Plan. We think that we as NATO, we should increase our outreach towards partners and other key actors, such as the Gulf Cooperation Council, the African Union, and individual state actors, starting with Saudi Arabia. We should increase the resilience of our partners in the southern flank, and by doing this, also we could bolster stability in the region. Our dividend will be easy to spot: greater latitude to focus on our most direct threats, including terrorism, and by doing so, we will also contribute to our fight in the battle of narratives that our competitors are waging and winning against us towards the global audience. I will stop here for now. I like to stop with a quote by Aldo Moro, who used to say that there's no difference between Europe and the Mediterranean because the whole of Europe is in the Mediterranean. And it is even more correct today than it was back in the 60s and 70s of last century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alessandro. Thank you also for providing a pretty clear view of Italian stance. And I always appreciate your frankness and being explicit about Russia, about underwater.
More frank later on.
I hope so. I hope so. But it was a good part.
What was written?
No, that's the reason we keep inviting him, as an Italian diplomat. It's pretty clear and straightforward, and very interesting mention also about supply chain and NATO EU membership. So now let's move north to my left with Klaus Korhonen, which is a former ambassador and head of mission of Finland to NATO, and he was there at the historic moment of the transition between being a partner and being a member. And so the question is quite obvious, but it's worthy to make and to have his personal view. It's could you tell us about Finland's choice to join NATO and its current outlook as a NATO member on the security of Northern Europe?
So it's easier if I stand. Maybe there was also the other map.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Very good. So, first of all, many thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. We need this kind of a dialogue. Finland is a new NATO member, and Italy is an old, distinguished NATO member. Finland is in the north, and Italy in the south. This is very, very useful. Thank you for the institute, and thank you also for the Finnish embassy. We don't have this conversation in the vacuum, so I just want to say at the outset that the first most important task for all of us is to continue supporting Ukraine any way we can, which also includes recognizing that Ukraine's place is in NATO, and we should recognize that this Ukraine's path towards NATO membership is irreversible. I think this is, very much the backdrop for our discussion today. But I really like this notion of NATO's 360 degrees. It means that every NATO ally should be interested in the security of every other ally, but also that NATO should be ready to respond to threats in any direction in the Euro-Atlantic area. I was just 2 weeks ago in Riga, speaking at the senior level course of the Baltic Defense College, which is the Baltic Academy, the Defense Academy of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And there were two very active senior Italian participants, one general and one admiral. I was really impressed about this interest. Also, the presence of southern NATO allies in the enhanced forward presence units, again in the Baltic states and in other countries of NATO's eastern flank, is significant. So NATO is very much about solidarity. I think if you would like to pick one word about NATO, what is the key? I think it's solidarity. And I think this kind of dialogue is a very good example of that. In Finland, we are of course here to learn about the objectives and needs of our new southern allies. Of course, we have been together in the European Union for a long time, so that helps. But we are trying to find our own role. This year, 2024, we participated in our first NATO's peacetime mission, and part of that was that Finland participated in the air policing, NATO's air policing mission in Bulgaria, Romania, and in the Black Sea region. So I think this was a very good start. But if we now move to Northern Europe and Finland's NATO membership, so Finland's accession to NATO was not and is not aimed against anybody. NATO is a defensive alliance, and this is maybe something that also our Russian neighbors have understood. Actually, the number of Russian troops has decreased after our accession to NATO. These troops have been transferred to a non-NATO country, Ukraine. But of course, one day when Russia's invasion against Ukraine ends, so it's very interesting to see where all those hundreds of thousands of Russian troops will be allocated after the war. But that's something that we will see. Now, here is a map of, how should I say, certain points of interest in Northern Europe. And just to go through a little bit, I mean, here I start first with the border between Finland and Russia. This border is longer than the border between Russia and all other NATO allies combined, 1,343 kilometers. So certainly a new challenge also to the alliance, but on the other hand, if you think that Northern Europe is, defined, marked by a triangle between the Baltic Sea, Northern Atlantic, and then the Arctic Ocean, so Finland and Sweden have been all the time there in between, so it really makes sense for us to join NATO, so that now we are all part of the same collective defense and same planning and same exercises. Of course, for Russia, also this region is very important. Murmansk and the Kola Peninsula, which also includes Russia's northern fleets, which is crucial for Russia's second strike capability when it comes to nuclear deterrence. So Russia has also a certain interest. Norway's Svalbard is certainly important, and this whole gap between Iceland, Greenland, Iceland, and UK is, of course, of interest for all of us. We have an interest in the capability of Russia to access Northern Atlantic and to maybe interrupt the sea route of then transfer of troops from Northern America to Northern Europe and Europe. It's true that the strategic posture of the Baltic Sea region has changed after Finland's and Sweden's accession, but still maybe I would not subscribe to the notion that the Baltic Sea region has become a NATO lake. We still have the freedom of navigation, and Russia still has significant forces in this region, including in the Leningrad district and here in Kaliningrad. And then Åland Islands, demilitarized Åland Island between Finland and Sweden, Gotland, which is crucial for the Baltic Sea defense, and then the Straits of Denmark, which are important for both Russia and all of us. Finland as such, we try to be a provider of security, not a consumer. Finland is a capable NATO ally. The wartime strength of Finland's defense forces is 280,000 troops, and the trained reserves are 900,000 troops in a country of 5.5 million people. Finland's artillery is the strongest in Western Europe, and we also invest in high-end capabilities. We will replace the F-18 jet fighter fleet with 64 F-35 jet fighters, same as Italy, and the first planes will start coming into Finland in 2026. There will also be a limited NATO presence in Finland. You mentioned that there is not yet military proper military presence in Finland, but there will be a forward land force. I would guess a rather small unit, but anyway, which we very much welcome. And also under all three joint force commands of NATO, Norfolk, Naples, and Brunssum, there will be also something which is called a land force command. And one of the land force commands of the land force command of JFC Brunssum will be in Mikkeli in Finland. So we are also part of NATO's development and the enhancement of NATO's collective defense also in this respect. I will stop here. I just mentioned 2 points about current developments in Finland's foreign and security policy. Something that you might have noticed, which is very important for us, is resilience, our ability to also cope with crises in the civil society, societal resilience, and our former president Niinistö has just delivered a report to the European Commission on how to enhance preparedness and readiness both in military terms and in civilian terms in the European Union, and I believe that also in the new program of the European Commission, so there will be elements of this report, but it's certainly worth reading. The other, which might be of interest at least for some in the audience, is that Finland will hold the OSCE Chairmanship, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, next year. We are now in the last phase of preparations, of course, in very difficult circumstances, but that's also, I think, which is part of this hopefully emerging better European security order. Thank you.
Thank you, Klaus. Thank you for providing Finnish views and numbers and information on the Finnish armed forces and outlook that probably are not that often heard in Italy. And this map is not the usual way Italy looks at Northern Europe and at Russian threat and the security landscape. So sometimes maps and images tells a lot about national strategic culture. That's the reason we embarked in this PowerPoint warfare, and I will present you one picture for each speaker during this roundtable. So we had 2 national perspectives. Now, let's move to the NATO level with Carolina Muti, senior researcher in the defense and security programs here at IAI. Carolina, my question for you is, what are the consequences and implications for European armed forces of NATO posture in Europe? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. So first, let me start by saying that in Madrid in 2022 during the NATO summit, with the renewed prioritization of deterrence and collective defense, the NATO posture was taken to a whole new level. The new NATO force model envisages, as you can see on the slides, a three-tiered structure of forces with the objective of deploying 100,000 troops within the first 10 days of a crisis, of an attack, 200,000 troops within the first 10 to 30 days, as you can see, and this is the second tier, and up to at least 500,000 troops within the first 1 to 6 months. So, in general, the overall goal is to have 300,000 troops at high readiness. And just to give you the idea, in 2022, when this goal was decided, the level of high readiness troops for NATO was of 40,000 at high readiness. So the proportion that now that you can see is that NATO aims to have 7 times more highly ready forces than we had in 2022. So this is just to give you the level and the scale of the ambition behind this idea. And this is a level of, this is a scale and readiness level that is in a way unprecedented for post-Cold War NATO. We know that we come from decades of expeditionary light forces, and our European troops, our militaries, were adapted to a whole different objectives in the last decades. So this is really a huge transformation, and the quality leap is not only in terms of scale, but of course in terms of command structures, of the logistics behind this change, troops mobility through Europe, the infrastructures needed. So all this follows these numbers. In parallel, you have 2 new allies that need to be integrated under the NATO command structure. You have new regional defense plans. So this is just to give you the idea of how radical transformation and different and parallel levels NATO is now undergoing. And the first consequence for European armed forces is the gap between the numbers that this ambition entails and the current number of troops in Europe that can be put on high readiness. So this is a very concrete and very practical, in a way, obstacle. And we know the difficulties, especially from larger allies in Europe, to reach these levels and to adapt their own internal organization to accommodate these numbers. And this is not only a matter of the number of troops available. It is also the fact that the troops need to be combat ready, of course. So if they need to be combat ready, they need to be well equipped and trained. And this opens a whole new level of discussion. And to complete the puzzle, if you take the number of our European armed forces to such an ambitious level, the other pieces of the puzzle need to follow, and they are the equipment that needs to be, in a way, our forces need to be equipped. So the pace of production of the equipment needs to be increased in Europe. And the last piece of the puzzle is the civil society preparedness, because we have seen in Ukraine that the armed forces don't fight alone. The civil society has its own role and needs to be resilient. And I think that our Finnish colleagues can teach us something about the whole of society approach in the response to a crisis. So this would be the third element that I would like to bring to the debate. And here I will stop, and maybe we can discuss further in the debate phase. Thanks.
Thank you, Carolina. Thank you for underlining also the military aspects of the topics we are discussing today. We don't have a military speaker at this panel today, but we draw a pretty, good bulk of studies we did on military aspects at TI, in close partnership with the armed forces, but with the freedom of speech of a think tank in underlining the problems, the needs, the obstacles that the armed forces in Italy and in Europe sometimes suffer in adapting to the new situation. So let's remain in this think tank university realm, and with the same spirit of constructive criticism and brainstorming. I'm really glad to give the floor to Anna Ojanen from Tampere University. Anna, we all heard the latest news on Trump and NATO. So an easy question for you, since you are an old friend of YAI. Which are the implications of the upcoming Republican administration for NATO, particularly with respect to collective deterrence and defense vis-à-vis Russia?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alessandro. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really personally very happy to be here again at LOIAI with all its great people. Has always been a very important reference point in my career. And of course, I look forward to discussing to your questions and comments. Now to Alessandro's question about the possible implications of a second Trump presidency for NATO. Perhaps particularly keeping in mind this northern perspective here. What do we know from the previous round? How did the first term actually go? Not that it necessarily matters, because we don't know whether the second one is similar to the first one. People often refer to unpredictability when speaking about Trump. But what we have is that we now have interesting research on what actually happened. NATO was among the many international organizations that were directly threatened by Trump's position, either threatened with exit of the US or with cutting funding. So the organizations had to do something. They were in trouble. They had different survival strategies that they could employ. Some organizations perhaps did not cope so well, WTO, for instance, but NATO did. It was prepared, and it used a strategy, according to these researchers who have been looking at it, that consisted in several different things. For instance, flattery. The Secretary General needed to flatter Trump quite a lot. Next, the agenda had to be modified every now and then, so that one would not speak about Russia when Trump was there. And perhaps there were some elements of touching to on the funding formula, so as to make, for instance, Germany look a bit better when it comes to defense spending. So different elements here and there, with the results that NATO survived and did not suffer too much. Now, will this continue? That's the question. I think it could, but now we can't avoid speaking about Russia. The situation is very different. Europe needs not only to spend more, but also be more independent. If Trump would put it in his language, perhaps do a fantastic job. So if we look at the future now from a perhaps Finnish point of view, the official line seems optimistic. Politicians at home would say that they coped, we coped during the first presidency, so we will cope with the second one too. But the difference is really, really big. last time Trump was president, Finland still had this old-time, historical, traditional role of a neutral host. And it hosted a meeting of Trump and Putin in Helsinki in July 2018. And we were all very proud of it. It was considered an honor for Finland and very positive to be in the limelight with these two leaders. Now the world is very different. And also, just hosting meetings might not be enough. That might not be what we want to do. What is needed instead is a more active role to ensure a certain outcome should these two come to meet and talk again. And I think this is something that is more than any third country alone could achieve. I think we need a shared view and a shared plan for what is to be done, especially so for Ukraine, that might see the NATO door being shut in front of them. Now, remember, Finland was in that position not so long ago. It was about to see the NATO door being shut in front of its nose in December 2021. That was when Russia proposed a deal to the US about not enlarging NATO anymore. And that was the point, as you certainly know, our president and prime minister very quickly picked this up and convinced even Sweden that this is a serious limitation of sovereignty and freedom of choice. And so it's now or never that we need to apply for membership. Now, the same deal-making hovers somehow over Ukraine, with some very problematic ideas about not letting Ukraine enter NATO for 20 years or something similar. I think, therefore, it's essential to make it clear for all that questions like NATO enlargement are questions for NATO members, not for third countries, such as Russia, to decide. So instead of deals above the heads of the Europeans, we need more work on preparing both Ukraine and NATO for this enlargement, and more credible and clear strategy for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you also for an original perspective on NATO's strategy to survive Trump and for underlying the differences that today it has to both cope with Trump and cope with the Russia-Ukraine war that was not there at this scale in 2016, 2020. I used this slide during your speech because it summarizes somehow how much Western Europe and North America is present in Eastern Europe as a forward defense. I cannot find a more updated one. It's 2022, so I have to add that Italy took the lead of the enhanced vigilance activity in Bulgaria, so it's the framework nation for the multinational battalion there, more than 1,000 troops, plus Italy has troops in Hungary, in Latvia, it deployed air defense SAMT in Slovakia, plus the air policing and the carrier strike group and so on and so forth. So it's it's already there in terms of numbers, but there is more. And I think that both Farnesina and Minister of Defense can do a better job in profiling what Italy does on an eastern flank in terms of information and infographic. But this is just a parenthesis. So please do it. From Tampere University to Università La Sapienza, I'm really glad to give the floor now to our last but not least speaker, Gabriele Natalizia, Associate Professor there. Gabriele, what is the possible NATO role on its southern flank in light of the Washington summit this summer and, again, also from your perspective, second Trump mandate?
Thank you, Alessandro, and let me express my gratitude to the Istituto Affari Internazionali, in particular to you and the director, Natalie Tocci, for having invited me here at this roundtable. Yesterday, Donald Trump spoke again of the NATO issue during an interview with NBC, and he reiterated that its new administration will take into consideration the exit option if NATO allies do not pay their bill. He has reaffirmed this concept a lot of times during the electoral campaign, and it was echoed also by his elected Vice President, J.D. Vance, who said NATO must avoid of being a welfare state tool and must turn into a real alliance. So it is clear their posture towards NATO. But while I doubt the sincerity of these statements, I'm convinced that their ultimate goal are clear: extracting further military spending commitments from European allies. They have also mentioned the possibility of 3%, that is confirmed also from the Polish part or by other allies. This kind of transactional attitude was a distinguishing trait of the first Trump administration. But this is tactics, and we must distinguish tactics from strategy. If we shift our attention on the latter, we can observe that the US grand strategy has been marked by the same strategic imperatives in the last 15 years. Pivot to Asia, burden sharing, and disengaging from non-vital areas. What's the not-so-new news? Unfortunately, that the southern flank, or as we Italians call the large Mediterranean, the wider Mediterranean, is not strategic from the US standpoint. Indeed, the US is committed in a competition with China, whose stakes is the world primacy, and whose expected battlefield would be the Indo-Pacific region. This does not mean that the enlarged Mediterranean will be considered as non-influential by the Trump administration. A long series of very recent events make this region, or make this scenario not probable. First of all, the crisis for the access to the Red Sea and its impact on the global commerce. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict and its impact in terms of legitimation or delegitimation for a leading country, for a leading power. And being the great power competition a form of absolute competition, ready to outbreak also in the large Mediterranean area. I think that the US is well aware of its importance, of the importance of the large Mediterranean, and maintains 25 military bases in the region and more than 40,000 soldiers deployed. So disengaging does not mean withdrawal, but to pass the buck as much as it is possible to the allies. And not only Israel or Saudi Arabia, but the most powerful allies, like some of the NATO allies. The final communication of the 2024 Washington Summit affirmed that NATO should play a more incisive role in the region, making the 360-degree approach reality. And it has instituted the role of a special representative for the southern neighborhood. It has relaunched the Hub for the South in Naples and the NATO ICI Center in Kuwait. It has announced the opening of a NATO liaison office in Amman. And finally, it has broadened the scope of support to the Iraqi security institutions and reaffirmed its engagement through NATO Mission Iraq. However, we must confess it, the southern flank remains a subordinate theater in NATO strategy at the moment, for two main reasons, it is my opinion. Because its threats, the threats coming from the southern flank, do not immediately threaten the territorial integrity of NATO members. Second, because it is difficult to find a single clear rival in the large Mediterranean, and as a consequence, to define a coherent strategy to contrast it. 20 years ago, the Bush administration provided the allies with the Global War on Terror framework to orient NATO's out-of-area projection. We must remember that some allies rejected it, especially after 2003. Nowadays, the challenge, we are facing the same challenge. Nowadays, Italy and all the countries interested in preserving both NATO and its security commitments must consolidate a new framework for approaching the southern flank. That of the contrast against the malicious policies of the revisionist powers, in particular that of Russia, that, as Natalie said before, it is accumulating chips usable on other tables. I want to stop here my speech by quoting or paraphrasing Lord Dismay. The advancement of this framework for interpreting NATO's approach towards the South, this would be the best mode to maintain the US in the southern flank and the Russian out from the southern flank. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabriele, for pushing the conversation on NATO and the southern flank with a kind of mix of the optimism of the willing and pessimism of the reason, quindi l'ottimismo della volontà e il pessimismo della ragione. Now, before opening the floor to questions, I put the slide on a large Mediterranean. Before I got fired by the Air Force at the table, let me say that this is not only a naval concept. So it's the blue water that you see, the light water you see, but it's about North Africa, Middle East, Sahel, Horn of Africa, the Gulf, the Black Sea region, together with Europe. So it's, in my view, it's a more, let's say, inclusive concept than talking about NATO's southern neighborhood. Because if you are deemed a neighborhood of something else, you know, it's not a better starting point for a conversation. If we talk in a more inclusive and paritatic way of the same region, perhaps it's a better starting point for talking with countries in that region. And it's much more better than arch of instability or arch of insecurity. So having said that, before I open the floor to questions, let me make my follow-up question. It's the same question for all 5 speakers. And the question is, looking at the next 4 years of Trump administration and beyond, would you suggest to your country and to NATO to bet, to push for EU strategic autonomy as an alternative to a NATO where the US will be more disengaged, more uncertain? Or would you recommend to bet, to push on a European pillar of NATO to make NATO collective deterrence and defense viable with the limited US commitment in Europe? Please say your preference and why in 2 minutes. And the answer, both EU and NATO, does not count. And we'll start in a reverse order. So from Gabriele Natalizia, La Sapienza, please.
Thank you so much, Alessandro. And I answer with the words of the former Secretary General of NATO, that was not particularly loved by Italians, but I think that was correct in this statement. He said, an European armed force already exists, and this European armed force is named NATO. I don't think that, I have already said it, I don't think that Donald Trump will act as a watershed for the NATO's destiny. But surely it will accelerate a process that is not the process of the European strategic autonomy, that I'm very afraid that is brain dead due to the Ukrainian war, but it will accelerate the project of a stronger European pillar within NATO. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriele. Anna and then Carolina.
Thank you. I'm really sorry the option of both and is not available. I think the pillar structure sounds very nice, but NATO is perhaps not an organization composed of pillars to start with. So you can't add a pillar where there are usually no pillars. I'm thinking of NATO more as a cobweb kind of organization with the US in the center. So if you build a pillar, I don't know whether it works. So my preference would go for European autonomy in a sense. And I'm thinking that this is what we already see. That is, perhaps we don't see autonomy yet, but what we see is that for NATO to proceed and do better what it should do, it already sees that it needs the EU for many things, for funding, infrastructure, armaments production, but also legislation when it comes to military mobility. So this would be my choice.
Thank you. Carolina.
Well, if I really have to choose between these two, I would say European pillar, but let me explain. I think that the Russia's aggression on Ukraine showed really how it was a reality check for both NATO and the EU, and it showed, I think, quite largely and broadly that the NATO is better equipped and has a more solid toolbox, in a way, ready to be the organization to defend and deter Russia. But this does not mean that that EU strategic autonomy is completely dead. I think that Russia's aggression forced us to talk a bit more realistically about EU strategic autonomy, and that means we heard a lot of terms like open strategic autonomy and complementarity between the EU and NATO. So if I have to choose, I choose the European pillar, but I think that we still need to talk about more strategic autonomy in specific sectors in defense and in a maybe more long-term perspective compared to the European pillar. Thanks.
Thank you, Carolina. And now it becomes more tough because we are heading towards a civil servant and not away from the think tank community. So, Klaus.
Yes, thank you for the question, and I think your point that we should actually very clearly define what we mean when we speak about strategic autonomy is very, very pertinent. So far, I can reflect on the basis of my 4 years as Finnish ambassador to NATO from 2019 to 2023. So there is a consensus, a unanimous view that collective defense in the Euro-Atlantic area is organized together, and it's organized in the framework of NATO. In a way, speaking in your terms, Alexander, I think it would question that consensus, and we were entered a completely different discussion. Regarding the priorities of the new American administration, so I think it's still good to remember that the new president is not even in office, so we really don't know. So very much the speculation about the choices that the new American administration will take, I mean, it is speculation. We don't know. I lived 2 years with Trump and 2 years with Biden as a NATO ambassador, and there, I mean, the difference was not that big, and the truth is also that American military presence in Europe was higher when Trump ended his presidency than when he started. But having said all this, I think it's very clear that we are heading towards a situation when the transatlantic bargain, has to be redefined a little bit. So far, after the Cold War situation has been that the United States, to defend its global interests, has had the need to have a very significant military capability, and that has also been enough to protect Europe. That's not the case anymore. I mean, we have had an increased Russian threat from the east, and on the other hand, the United States is challenged by China. So I think what we will do, we will increase our capabilities, we will increase our defense spending, but I hope that we continue to do this together in this transatlantic community. Thank you.
Thank you. Alessandro, the reverse order gave you at least 5 minutes to think your answer, so you're in a good position.
Yeah, sure. I'm not in a very good position because everything has been said already. The point is about what Trump will do. I honestly do not think that even Trump knows it. So I mean, every time I'm reading, oh, Trump will, I don't think that Trump knows what he will do. So I think it's useless. And on pillar versus strategic autonomy, I'd like to, I mean, I've been dealing with European defense for the last 15 years, so since times when it was not fashionable nor sexy yet. Now everybody's talking about that. But I think there is not that, it's not that a dichotomy. I think that the European, I mean, first, I do not understand exactly what strategic autonomy means. I can ask any French, but also Natalie. But I still do not think that that such a concept has been organized already. And second, I think that the well-established American industrial and military system will not allow any administration to abandon NATO. And third, I think that we have two sets of concerns. The first is a strategic concern, long-term. Well, in the long term, John Keynes used to say that we're all dead. So, I mean, let's say the mid-term. And first, a short-term kind of set of concerns. For the short term, we just have NATO, and we should rely on NATO, on what we have. The toolbox that we have. The only kind of military defense of Western Europe lies in what NATO is and always been. And in the midterm, of course, we have to build something different, something more as EU. Like, for example, a common defense industry and technology base, some shared programs. We have to find money. We cannot stick to old-fashioned, frugal versus the generous or whatever. And in this way, NATO and Europe, and I'm talking about Europe, not just the EU, because I think that European defense is something more, because it means having the UK in, having Norway in, and not just the EU, even if, as I said before, 97% of EU population is composed by NATO member country citizens, so we shouldn't create such a non-existing dichotomy. But I think that in the midterm, we have to strengthen the European pillar in this way, the European technology, economy, financial pillar. That's important, because if you put the defense expenditure of the 27 countries, you have more or less 32% of what America is spending, what the US are spending. I'm very generous if I define our military capacity as 10% of them. I mean, it's a usual mantra of mine. I've written about it. I've said many times the same thing, but it's what I believe. I mean, it means, of course, spending more, but it means first and foremost spending better what we spend, because today we're not spending in the right direction, in the right way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessandro, and thank you everyone in the panel for taking the challenge of my second question. So now the floor is open for question. I kindly ask any of you to raise your hand, wait for the microphone, and make your question. And by question, I mean something like a sentence with a question mark at the end, so to stimulate the conversation. It's a qualified audience, I trust. Just a kind reminder, and please also say your name and surname before the question to introducing yourself. So I see already a hand back there, Professor Silvestri, and another Professor Strazzari. And let's start with this.
Thank you, Alessandro. First of all, let me say that I think that there is no hope of European defense without the contribution of the United States. Only the United States have a number of enablers that we do not have, simply. Stop. So we need the United States for European defense. In the worst case, should the Americans in some case withdraw, our main effort, more than creating a non-existent system, military system, would be to try to keep Europe together, because the main problem would be that each one would tend to go different direction. So that would be in case the worst case. But my question is in any way, I agree that we should have a greater European presence in military affairs and in the defense of Europe, and especially in the defense of the eastern border. My question is that we probably will not achieve that through the normal channels. Is there any other idea of how to reach this point? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps it's better if I stand. Francesco Strazzari, Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies. I have two questions with a question mark, hopefully a bit provocative. The first one is about the map of the enlarged Mediterranean, which sounds all good, but I'm afraid it doesn't go down well if you look at that from the south. I'm afraid that kind of cartography, the signals we're getting from the south is that it's not something that is accepted eagerly. So I'm wondering to what extent is that line to be taken seriously? I mean, the sequence of coup d'etat in Africa, but also within the new constitutional process is giving us different kind of symptoms. And I guess there is a need for rethinking a bit also the way we project our cognitive representation. The second question is about, a bit picking up on Professor Silvestri, on the question of unity of Europe. My sensation is that the two different fronts, the south and the north, are somehow envisioning different military models when we talk about strengthening the defense sector and so on. On the one hand, the Baltic Nordic with a certain way of constituting, the way we spend, the kind of industry which is needed, and the second, in the south, there's a more traditional, if you wish, way in which a military model has been constituted. I'm wondering to what extent you see the two, under what condition the two might converge or diverge, because I think the problem of Europe going different ways is present. We see certain dynamics there, and if we think, or if we declare, as we have heard recently, that the new model needs, imposes as imperative, redrawing the social pact in Europe, there will be tensions in Europe, and those tensions might not go one way only. Thank you.
Thank you for this very too broad, stimulating question. So any speaker is free to pick and choose and give an answer. Let me say just two things. This map is the map of Italian military operations abroad. 34 operations in 25 countries. The pinpoints are where they are located. So you see a country that is present military in the Baltic Sea, in Eastern Europe, but a lot in North Africa, Sahel, or North Africa, and the Middle East. And this tells you something about the outlook of Italy. The second thing I want to say is that some junior colleagues very generously are listening our debate from another room, because this room was too packed. But since now we have some chairs left, if they want to join us, they can come and make questions live in the room. So after this housekeeping, who wants to start with an answer?
Yes. Thank you for these questions. Just 2 points. I think that your previous map was very good about this enlarged Mediterranean, and maybe we have now spoken about EAT, but how should I say, as a person who comes from the north, so I would say that when I look at this map, I think it's clear that also the security challenges of this region are significant, that they matter to us. Maybe it's right that there is no direct military threat, let's say, against Italy, but there are other challenges. Russia is present in North Africa. There is the challenge of uncontrolled migration. There is the challenges of terrorism, the challenges of trafficking of drugs and people and so on. So there are challenges. Instability in this region. It's not in our interest, and I think it's not either in the interest of the North America. But actually, what I'm eager to learn also in this event, that what is NATO's role specifically, because NATO has a certain toolbox that it has developed over these 75 years, and my question is that what in your view, you are better experts than I am, what exactly are the tools that NATO would be best in applying in this region? Thank you.
Well, thank you for providing a further question instead of an answer, but I'll try to respond later. You want to take that, Max? Okay.
Sure. On Professor Silvestri's question, yes, there are different formats which are being explored so far, because as I used to say in a very politically incorrect way, in defense we should not count ourselves, we should weigh ourselves. I'm sorry, with all due respect for everybody, the fact that some small country could spend 2, 3, 4, 6% of its GNP doesn't mean a lot as far as capabilities are concerned. Because if I have, what a plus 4% of a small country GNP could mean in military terms, a division, so what? While a 1% plus in a big country, expenditure means a lot more. And I'm sorry, but in defense, the size does matter. On map lines, normally I don't take map lines too seriously. I think that could be useful for scholars, for thinkers, for diplomats, in order to assess, to organize our thinking, but they're not useful in reality at all. If we consider them real, there's nothing such as if you keep talking about, with all due respect, broader Mediterranean, broader Middle East, enlarged Mediterranean, then Indo-Pac, you have everything. There's one map, which is the world. And this is very clear to me. We're facing a new kind of Cold War. And a Cold War is global in itself. And this Cold War, which I call Cold War 2.0, is not even ideological. So it's even more dangerous than the previous one, which had some, barriers, ideological barriers. There's nothing such as ideological barriers so far. So it's complicated, very much. And on the rest, yes, there are different ways. I cannot answer to your second question, Professor, because there is no answer to me. If you find one, please contact me. But there is no answer. On the other hand, I'm very glad about the map that the other Alessandro here showed before, because it shows the difference between a security provider such as Italy and some security consumer. Because if I keep hearing about 2%, 3%, 4%, whatever, so I'm asking myself why a country which spends 1.54% like Italy must provide security for countries which spend a lot more. And the answer is the same that I gave to Professor Silvestri, is because in defense we weigh ourselves, we don't count ourselves. Thank you.
Who else? Let's continue.
If I may, to Professor Silvestri, other channels to increase European presence on Eastern Flank. Actually, I think that if we take seriously the new NATO force model and we implement it, this could be the right direction. The problem is how quickly we are able to implement it. I think that the direction is there, but I don't think we are quick enough in reaching this goal. And to Professor Strazzari, to the second point on the two different fronts and two different military models, I think that, and under what condition these two models converge, I think that in military terms, this is NATO's job to ensure that they converge in terms of interoperability, training and exercise standards. The issue is the second thing that you said. From the societal point of view, this is more complex, of course, the threat perception and how, what level of military expenditure and, in a way, sacrifices our societies are willing to take on the two sides of Europe. And I don't have, unfortunately, an answer to this question. I think that from the military point, it's NATO's job to do this, but on the societal level, it will be an issue for the future.
Thank you, Alessandro. Maybe I may answer to the first question of Professor Strazzari, and I completely agree with him when he says that a lot of African countries could perceive that map, that of the large Mediterranean, as a sort of attempt to establish a new primacy in the area. But this is our task, to avoid this. Even because we need to explain to the African countries that the risk is that the same area could be subjected to the primacy of both Russia on the one side and China on the other side. How can we explain it? That our intentions are not that of the primacy or are not post-colonial attitudes. First of all, we should enhance partnerships with all the like-minded countries of the area, and we should include southern flank countries in the annual summits, not as happened in the last NATO summit in Washington, because it could allow their deeper socialization to our values and interests, as well as it could strengthen the legitimacy of the alliance, also among their public opinion. Secondly, we should empower the special representative for the southern neighborhood. We should revitalize cooperation with the Mediterranean dialogue and the ICI countries, and especially I think that we should formalize the relations with the African Union and with the ECOWAS.
Thank you. At this point, I don't have that much to add. The questions were really crucial, and we got many points of answer already. I think the notion that you just mentioned, legitimacy, is key. How NATO is seen by the member states and by outsiders. If we think about the military operations in Sahel, for instance, Western operations that have been ended recently, the situation is difficult, and NATO needs to sort of think about its double role, if it is a double role, like defense of the territory of the member states and a role outside. It's not easy at all. And when it comes to the different models the different countries have, I'm thinking that one thing to start with is that they still complement each other. That is where we need to start from. And as Carolina said, it is one of the key objectives of NATO to shape that variety and to know that variety and start shaping it. But there you need to have clear goals as to where you are going.
Yes, if I can just add a brief point, actually, as a follow-up to what you said. Finland spends at this moment 2.5% of its GDP to defense. So you're quite right, of course, in terms of the alliance. I mean, it doesn't make a big difference, but it makes a big difference for Finland. It means that Finland, to a large extent, can defend itself, defend its territorial integrity, defend its sovereignty, so that the other allies can maybe focus their attention mainly on other directions. So in that sense, I think also our military spending, which is, the seventh highest according to this measurement in the alliance, also has a certain significance to the alliance as a whole. I have not seen this map before. I think it's very impressive. I mean, it really shows, your contribution in terms of, the very large Euro-Atlantic and African security, and also I think the geographic scope of your effort is significant.
Other questions from the audience? Please, it's your last 12 minutes. It's your chance, please.
Thank you. I was in the team following the discussion in the other room, so I followed the whole discussion. I didn't arrive now. My question is a follow-up to Alessandro's question about European pillar versus strategic autonomy. And it is, I agree on the fact that even Trump probably doesn't know what to do on this topic, but let's take the extreme hypothesis in which he keeps threatening getting out of NATO, he keeps weakening the alliance. Would it be enough to revitalize the project of a European strategic autonomy at the EU level or in other formats? And related to this, how much does European countries' military budget count? So if we had higher military budgets, would we have, as a consequence, more political unity to form a project of strategic autonomy, or is it something pretty much unrelated? Thank you.
Good point. Other points? Sir, the first line. The mic is coming.
Thank you. I was late, so I don't know if you have discussed about it. But the point is, European foreign policy until now has been a little bit a failure in general terms. I mean, the European Foreign Service has not been a success. So how could we expect the possibility of the European Union, in terms of defense, to function well? That's the question for me. That's the point. Thank you.
Any other question? Okay, 3, 2, 1. Let's close with a round of comments by each speaker, and then I will also pick up the question made by Klaus on NATO Toolbox. So, Alessandro, would you mind to start?
Yeah, you asked wonderful questions, but unfortunately, both of them would need a crystal ball. And I am scared of diplomats who turn or disguise themselves as prophets, because normally we are not good in that. I hope you're right. I mean, I hope that the continuous menace, threat to have the US out of Europe would serve as a great wake-up call. But how many wake-up calls we need? I think we had enough wake-up calls. In spite of that, we're still questioning. We're making some steps in the right direction. There's the negotiation ongoing on EDIP, on the European Defense Industry Program, which is going into the right direction, which is trying to create a common defense industry, defense and technology ground. There are lots of discussion ongoing whether they're taking us up to a kind of higher ground or not. I have some question marks. I mean, I think that if we leave NATO aside and we go for this strategic autonomy, whatever, we would lose everything we did since the start of NATO, as far as interoperability, as far as coordination of our chains of command. If we start again with something European, to have a new chain of command and so on, I think that it will take years or decades. I quite disagree with Paolo on this, because I don't think that the European foreign policy is a failure. I think of where we were before and where we are now, with European embassies around everywhere, with the need of coordinate our foreign policy position day by day, week by week. Every month, all ministers of foreign affairs meet with each other and quarrel with each other. I think I've attended like 42 or 43 foreign affairs councils and 5 or 6 Gymnich meeting. I think they're quite lively, and lately even more lively than before. So I think that we should keep an eye inside, and let's not listen to some Cassandras around. A lot must be done. There's a lot to be done, but a lot has been done already. So I'd like to have something more enlightened to say, but unfortunately I don't.
As I said in the beginning, I see NATO as a joint effort, a collective defense in NATO, but it's also, I think your question is very pertinent in the sense that if individual allies spend more in their defense, they also have a bigger political say in NATO. I'm not in favor of creating blocks within NATO, a Nordic bloc or a EU caucus, but certainly we are lagging behind in Europe, and if we spend more, so we have also a stronger political influence. Then European Union is something different, and I think there was a good point made that NATO and the European Union also in security, they can complement each other very nicely, and something maybe that has not been mentioned is the need to improve cooperation between the European Union, NATO, and this is, I mean, for Finland as a small country who is a member of both now the Alliance and European Union, this is a vital security interest.
I have an example for this, Ambassador. Some time ago, NATO procurement issued a bid for 155 millimeters artillery shells for Ukraine, and a Slovak company won the bid. Then, after a few months, EDA issued the same bid. The European Defence Agency issued the same bid for the same kind of ammunition, and the same Slovak company won the bid for 3 times the price. Of course, the Slovak company won the bid. Good for them. They got 3 times the gains that they thought they could have from NATO, and of course they paid the fee because they could afford. Who's paying the bill? Us. Because as I said before, 97% of you citizens. This is what European defense should start from, avoiding this kind of stuff. I would leave the philosophy to the philosophers, but as practitioners as we are, we should stick to the ground and to very grassroots level. Let's start spending better, and we should spend more. But let's start first and foremost to spend better what we spend, which is not enough, by the way. I personally see our defense expenditure going up to 3%, 4%, because I don't see this conflict, this global confrontation going away magically in the foreseeable future. I'm sorry for that, of course. I'm not happy.
Yeah, I completely agree with what have been said before me. Just 2 elements. To Mariano on how much the budget counts and how it is related to unity of member states. Actually, I think it's not, unfortunately. The paradox is that we are spending more in defense as Europeans, but the percentage of budget that we spend cooperatively among Europeans is decreasing and is stagnating or decreasing if you look at European Defense Agency data. So this is a paradox, but in a way it answers your question. And on European foreign policy, I agree that maybe the results are not what we would want it to be, but if we take the fact that in 2021 we even didn't have, if we think about the European Defence Fund, this is something that was born in 2021. So I think that we have to give a bit of the time for the Europeans to develop a proper foreign and defense policy. It is going in an incremental way. It's not, there are not big, in a way, quality leaps there, I think. But I think we should think about the fact that it is kind of a recent endeavor. So probably we don't have time, but we will need time to see more concrete developments, I think.
Thank you. The question about the EU foreign policy or foreign security and defense policy is always a good one. And I think the EU could do more there to sort of, or more precisely be a bit bolder in using certain tools that it has, that NATO, for instance, doesn't have, but that the EU hasn't been using either. And I'm thinking of, industrial policy is one, a single market for defense, but also the use of qualified majority voting, which would be impossible in NATO, but which could be possible in the near future in the EU. Also using budget differently, using the EU's own budget, for instance, for the rapid deployment capacity. I think if we created the EU budget now, it would be clear that it would go to these kinds of things, and it would no longer be the member state's responsibility to fund these troops. And also thinking about the possibility that the EU troops, be it battle groups or the rapid deployment capacity, could also be used on the EU's own territory and not only outside, which would also be really natural if we started now, but we happened to draw these plans a long time ago when the situation was different.
Thank you, Alessandro. Just on the first question, yes, I'm absolutely convinced that the US exit from NATO would revitalize the project of strategic autonomy. But I am also convinced, absolutely, that it will need 15 years for producing security, 10 years in the best case, I don't know. In the meantime, we will be already transformed in members of the new Russia sphere of influence, or almost a huge number of our current allies will be transformed in. The problem is, let's take into consideration the opinion polls for what concern Italy. The most of Italian people do not support the increase of military expenditure or a significant increase of military expenditure, also after the start of the Ukrainian war. And I don't think that they will change their opinion after the election of Donald Trump or after the election or after the exit of the US from NATO. Maybe we need another kind of shock, but I don't hope that this shock will occur.
I wanted just to add to what Gabriele Natalizia said on the NATO toolbox for the South, to do just a practitioner really close to the ground example. European Union deployed a naval operation, Aspides, in the Red Sea to protect the sea line of communication from the Houthis attack. Could please NATO share your intelligence with the European Union in that mission? Because I think it's not happening because of the good old vexata question between Turkey and Cyprus. So this would be a very concrete way for NATO to help the European Union, sharing intelligence about that part of the world where an EU operation is taking care of sea line of communication and energy supplies and import and export from NATO members through the Indo-Pacific. But beyond that, I would just do my pet plea for Italy to not talk only about the large Mediterranean in NATO avenues, because Italy has an interest in talking about what peace solution for Ukraine, in having a dialogue on the negotiations that are going to happen about Russia and Ukraine. Italy has an interest in cyber defense and has cyber capabilities. Italy has an interest in space as an operational domain and has big space capabilities. Italy is cooperating with Japan on the Global Combat Air Program, so it has an interest in a NATO cooperation with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, and so far and so on, and NATO-EU cooperation, of course. So I think that on arms control and non-proliferation, Italian expertise is huge, and it's underexploited. And Italy is a member of the nuclear planning group and hosts tactical nuclear weapons and has dual-capable aircraft. So Italy has a stake on a number of points of NATO agenda. And if Italy says something on this point, maybe it gets also more credibility and support from its own priority on the southern neighborhood. And every time I travel abroad, I feel disconnect between the Italian debate on Italy, which is only on this slide, and the debate in NATO, which is on this slide. Only this slide. So this event, in my idea, was also meant to connect a bit these two Italian and NATO debates. So having said that, let me thank again the Finnish Embassy in Rome for partnering in this event, and particularly Ambassador Matti Lasilla. Thanks to all speakers and our keynote speaker for their valuable input. Thanks to the audience for your attention over the last couple of hours and questions. Thanks to Maria Bava, back there, the event coordinator at TI, for making it happening tonight in a very smooth way. And in the spirit of mutual understanding, complementarity and cooperation, we are going to taste the Finnish cuisine for the happy hour and the aperitif in the same room. But before, please join me in a round of applause to our speakers.